The ravaging of Africa has been enriching Europe and North America for more than 500 years.
First, European empires imposed slavery and colonialism on the continent.
After 1945, the United States took over as the dominant neo-colonial power.
Through the Pentagon and the CIA, the U.S. government has fueled 14 wars in Africa with arms transfers and military training.
It is American invasion, but the U.S. role is everything.
The U.S. has used the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund to systematically demolish African economies and health and education sectors.
Par les stratégies de la Banque mondiale, les pauvres seront toujours pauvres, les riches seront toujours riches.
This military and economic war enables the looting of Africa's resources by Western multinational corporations.
Shell is into the politics of Nigeria, you know. One might say we have our independence, but economically we are still being colonized.
Washington's genocidal imperial strategy has killed more than 26 million Africans, but failed to suppress popular resistance.
We have refused to die. We are living for Africa. No matter what they do, no matter what power they have.
You are listening to The Ravaging of Africa, a 4-part documentary series about the destructive impact of U.S. imperialism on the continent. I'm Asad Ismi.
I'm Kristen Schwartz.
Voices and sounds in this series were recorded at the 2007 World Social Forum, held in Nairobi, Kenya.
This is Economic War, the second episode in our series. For the next half hour, we highlight the role of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. This episode features voices from Guinea, Zambia, Kenya, and South Africa. Stay tuned.
Washington has fomented not only military conflict in Africa, but also an economic war through its agents, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, known as the overlords of Africa. The structural adjustment programs imposed by these institutions on 36 African countries since 1980 have devastated the continent, decimating national economies and health and education systems. Structural adjustment programs offer loans on condition that governments drastically reduce public spending, especially on health, education, and food subsidies, in favor of repayment of debt owed to Western banks. Governments must also increase exports of raw materials to the West, encourage foreign investment, and privatize state enterprises. The last two steps mean selling whatever national assets a poor country may have to Western multinational corporations.
Under structural adjustment programs, sub-Saharan Africa's external debt has actually increased more than 5 times since 1980. This is despite the fact that African countries have paid back 4 times their 1980 debt to Western banks. In 1997, the United Nations Development Program stated that in the absence of debt payments, severely indebted African countries could have saved the lives of 21 million people and given 90 million girls and women access to basic education by the year 2000. The All-African Conference of Churches has called the debt, quote, a new form of slavery as vicious as the slave trade, unquote.
After more than 2 decades of structural adjustment programs, 350 million Africans live in absolute poverty out of 682 million. The number of poor people has increased by 75% since 1994. Life expectancy has dropped by 15% since 1980, and today is 47 years, the lowest in the world. 40% of Africans suffer from malnutrition, and more than half are without safe drinking water. Healthcare spending in the 42 poorest African countries fell by 50% during the 1980s. As a result, healthcare systems have collapsed across the continent, creating near-catastrophic conditions. More than 200 million Africans have no access to health services, as hundreds of clinics, hospitals, and medical facilities have been closed. This has left diseases to rage unchecked, leading most alarmingly to an AIDS pandemic. More than 17 million Africans have died of HIV/AIDS, which has created 12 million orphans. 28 million Africans currently have HIV.
About 40% of African children are out of school, and the adult literacy rate in sub-Saharan Africa is 60%, well below the average in developing countries of 73%. More than 140 million young Africans are illiterate. Given the annihilating social impact of structural adjustment programs all over Africa, it's not surprising that Emily Sikazwe, director of the Zambian anti-poverty group Women for Change, has asked, what would the World Bank and the IMF say if we took them to the World Court in The Hague and accused them of genocide?
In Guinea, World Bank and IMF structural adjustment programs have left half of the people in poverty and 45% of them unemployed. Yet Guinea, like the Congo, is very rich in natural resources containing half the world's bauxite reserves used to make aluminum, the third largest gold and diamond deposits in Africa, and 4 billion tons of iron ore. Bauxite exports provide 80% of Guinea's foreign exchange, and the state aluminum company has been privatized, with 51% of it being owned by Alcoa, the US multinational, and Alcan, the Canadian corporation. Most revenue from Guinea's main income earner thus leaves the country.
Under pressure from Washington and the International Monetary Fund, the country's US-backed military dictator, Lassana Conté, cut social spending and price subsidies in 2006. This led to mass demonstrations against Conté, culminating in a general strike led by labor unions which paralyzed Guinea in January 2007. Conté reacted by declaring martial law and unleashing the army, which killed 100 demonstrators. The general strike ended on February 27th after Conté agreed to appoint a new prime minister acceptable to the unions. Since then, the army itself has revolted against Conté, with soldiers looting towns and terrorizing civilians because they say the government hasn't paid their salaries and owes them $93 million.
Bakary Fofana is director of the International Trade Center for Development in Guinea.
Les politiques d'ajustement structurel, les exigences de la Banque mondiale actuellement ont fini par détruire le seul instrument qui est à la disposition des citoyens, instrument collectif qui est l'État. L'État aujourd'hui est détruit.
The rules set by the IMF are destroying the state in African countries, which is the one common thing that the people have and own.
Justement. Et si l'État est détruit, c'est la justice économique, c'est le développement équilibré au niveau national qui sont totalement détruits.
The government is destroyed, the state is destroyed, and this represents a social and economic injustice.
Privatization enforced by the World Bank in Guinea has created its massive unemployment and impoverishment.
In most African countries, including my own today, there are no more national industries left. They've been taken over by privatization. It is privatization that comes in a situation where there is no local economy. There is no local financial structure in place for a local capitalism to grow and thus create a local industry. So there is no economic development. The fact that there is no local industry and there is no local economy anymore, the effect of this is that there is no income from the resources in a country that is going towards government. There is nothing for the government to take from the workforce and from the resources in the country. So the situation is very bad.
De 1960 à 1983, on avait plus de 200 entreprises nationales.
In Guinea, between 1960 and 1983, there were more than 200 national enterprises. These were enterprises set up by the state. These companies produced everything from shoes to medicines to juice, all consumer products that were used daily. In 1983, the government changed hands and the new government decided to adopt a new form of politics. The World Bank came as consultant and they pushed for the privatization of the 200 enterprises. Today, none of these enterprises, none of these factories are functioning. What is said is that the price for which they sold these was very, very low. What the World Bank suggested was that the government had to get out of the manufacturing sector and leave that in private hands. These enterprises were selling not only within the country but also selling to neighboring countries. They were functioning well.
Ces entreprises also ont disparu. Aucune de ces entreprises n'est opérationnelle aujourd'hui.
The World Bank's demand that Guinea cut social spending has caused the collapse of the health and educational systems.
Le taux de couverture sanitaire aujourd'hui est extrêmement bas, puisque la Banque mondiale et le système économique qui a été mis en place empêchent effectivement à la